His new book is sending shockwaves throughout the world. This should be an international bestseller. I got to tell you, folks, I think it's one of the most informative books I've ever read, and it really ties in the puzzle that we've been working on all these years, and I just thank God for this. A terrible mistake, the murder of Frank Olson and the CIA's Cold War experiments. It's documents, it's pictures, and it's about 900 pages of information you're not supposed to know about. A lot of it hunted down by our guest today, Hank Albarelli, revealed mostly a lot of it for the very first time. And this is something every American needs to know. I mean, they say that our government wouldn't kill people. They wouldn't hurt people. When you read this book, you won't believe that anymore. And it's unfortunate, but the truth will set us free. Knowing that this happens is going to lead us out of this terrible nightmare, which really did start back in the 1950s. Hank, I really appreciate you being here with us, and I want to tell people they can go to your website at albarelli.net, ALBARELLI, albarelli.net, and of course they can go to Trine Day to order the book, and I just hope everybody gets it. It's about $35. It'll be the best money you ever spent, because you'll be an expert on the subject, thanks to you, Hank. What happened, and that is, well, we found out, thanks to a major break in the case, which is near the end of your book, in 2001, you were working with the district attorney's office in New York. And
yes.
You had some informants who, thankfully, Albert and Neil came out, these whistleblowers, and they kind of blew the lid off this, didn't they?
They did. Actually, at that point in time, they totally blew the lid off things, and that really... there's no two way to put it. It really messed things up for the district attorney's office in New York, because I had come to the conclusion they weren't very sincere about their investigation that they had reopened in the 1990s. Anyway, it was primarily to placate Eric Olson, the survivors of the Olson family, and their attorneys, but with no real intent to get to the truth. But unfortunately, they found out that I was researching a book, and they invited me to New York to share information, and it really threw a monkey wrench into the works.
And thank you. If it hadn't have been for his own children, Frank Olson's children, we might not ever know this story, and you as well for printing it up and spending all this time on it. What actually happened was, and I'll give away the end of this, but you're going to want to read all the fill-ins. Frank Olson had been drugged at Deep Creek Lake, not to explore the drugs, but because he'd been talking to the wrong people, quote-unquote, about top-secret SOD experiments that had taken place in France in the summer of 1951. The CIA and the Army, deeply concerned about his security violations, wanted to know the full extent of his indiscretions. Frank Olson had been given the drugs at Deep Creek Lake to enhance his interrogation, and what he was talking about is Project Span. If you could tell us about that, please.
Sure, it's a Project Span. It was a pretty innocuous label to put on a project. Didn't sound very exciting, but it actually turned out to be quite mind-blowing. I assume they called it Span because it took place in a small French town that nobody had ever heard of. I certainly never heard of it, called Pont Saint-Esprit. And pont in French means bridge, and I assume that was the connection between the label Span. But in a nutshell, what they did was it had been recommended early, actually in 1949, by the head of research at Edgewood Arsenal, a fellow called L. Wilson Green, that the Army strongly pursue the use of LSD as an offensive weapon to conduct non-lethal warfare. Green actually thought that LSD had enough potential to displace the use of guns and bombs, and that nations could actually conduct warfare using mind-blowing drugs.
And it would just confuse the enemy, and the enemy, and they just give up, right, Frank? That was
I guess I'm not really sure what they had in mind. I have his files, but he never created a scenario that I thought was workable or made any sense. But what he did recommend, and what the Army agreed with was that they go out and conduct a number of field experiments as quickly as possible. And initially, they were going to use New York City, believe it or not, but that was postponed, and because the FBI got wind of it and approached people in the Pentagon and said, wait a minute, you cannot do this in New York City. And to make a long story short, they ended up in this small village in France, and they dosed 500 to 600 people in the village with LSD to see what the reaction would be.
They did that with aerosol. This is what Frank worked on, was aerosol spraying. And they did this, and, you know, I have a DVD here called Aerosol Crimes, which gets into some pretty heavy stuff, Hank. But that's what they did. They used crop dusters, and they just laced the whole town and sprayed the whole town. And people died, and people went crazy. They went insane.
Yeah, it's really interesting. What's one of the minor points, a lot of people haven't picked it up from the book, maybe because I didn't emphasize it strong enough, but the psychiatrist who Olson had been taken to in New York right prior to his suicide actually had been one of the pioneers in aerosol use in warfare. And so there was a little bit more of a motive for picking him as a person allegedly to talk to Olson and to treat his so-called depression. It really kind of fleshed the story out. But the experiment in Pont Saint-Esprit it really backfired on the Army because a number of people really went crazy, and a number of people ended up committing suicide, and so they weren't real happy with those results.
Well, that's kind of what they wanted to see happen, though, isn't it?
Well, they wanted to see if they could induce enough psychosis just to disable people. But the scientists I talked to that were involved in the experiment said that actually after the experiment was over, they weren't happy with the fact that people had died. I guess there was some guilt at that point in time.
Oh.
And there were no additional aerosol experiments until they refined a drug called BZ, which is a much stronger hallucinogenic, but that didn't come down the road for another 5 or 6 years, and that was used in Vietnam with disastrous results also.
That would be Project Phoenix, no doubt, and some of those same people in charge today. Hank, so Frank Olson, he told a few people about this, including his neighbor who turned him in. That's a lesson to you out there.
That's right. His neighbor was also a Dietrich colleague,
yeah.
and his neighbor knew you just don't break your security oath. And
so the dosing at Deep Creek wasn't so much aimed at all the people attending this conference or this meeting. It was aimed at Frank Olson as a truth serum. They also mixed in something else that has been known to open up your mind and your lips